welcome to One-Sided Debates. This is our very first episode. We are very nervous, but we're going to try to do our best, so let's have a little fun with it. Alright, I'm going to read the speech that I prepared. Let's see what it's like coming out of my mouth. Here on One-Sided Debates, we believe that ideas are just that, ideas. They need to be nurtured, investigated, researched, supported by evidence, wrestled with, and ultimately strength-tested in the forge of debate against unknowing and most likely unapproving opponents. We believe that one must earn their opinion. If you don't earn it, it's just an opinion, and might as well be burned like the backyard garbage it is. On today's episode, through the magic of audio editing, we'll be joined by neuroscientist and author Sam Harris. He'll be forced to debate against us on the following questions. Is honest conversation being silenced by leftist orthodoxy? Will the protests work in Trump's favor? Is policing in the U.S. worse for blacks? And can and should policing be reformed? So in crafting my side of the debate, I took great effort to cite as many studies, polls, articles, and references as I could muster. However, this being an audio recording, I think it's quite obvious that it'll be difficult for you to click on all the links, as technology does not yet allow me to embed them into my voice. But what you can do is go to the companion Medium post that we've put together, which has all the links embedded. The link to that is in the show notes below. By the way, this is an abridged version of the full audio. If you've got 3 hours to kill, you can find the full version also in the show notes below. Sam's audio comes from the June 12th, 2020 Making Sense with Sam Harris podcast episode, Can We Pull Back from the Brink? All right, without further ado, let's get to the debate. Welcome to the One-Sided Debates podcast, Sam.
Welcome to the Making Sense podcast.
No, this is the One-Sided Debates podcast.
This is Sam Harris.
Yeah, no, I know.
Okay.
All right, Sam. As our guest, I'd like to allow you the opening salvo. So, what do you got?
Well, I've been trying to gather my thoughts for this podcast for more than a week.
Thanks, Sam. That means a lot.
I've actually been unsure about whether to record it at all, frankly.
But we validated your parking.
I mean, conversation is the only tool we have for making progress. I firmly believe that.
Well, I might add to that rather short list. Protests, rallies, journalism, books, documentaries, historical analysis, sociological study, petitions, legislation, local nonprofits, education, just to name a few. Unless you just mean people sharing ideas, which is nearly everything that happens in the world when more than one human is involved.
But many of the things we most need to talk about seem impossible to talk about.
Oh yeah? Why is that?
I think social media is a huge part of the problem. I've been saying for years now that with social media, we've all been enrolled in a psychological experiment for which no one gave consent.
Sure, but one could make the same argument about being born a citizen of a certain country, or into a certain socioeconomic class, or even being born at all.
On the most important topics, it now seems to be fury and sanctimony and bad faith almost all the time.
Sam, what are these most important topics? And what is the evidence of fury and sanctimony and bad faith almost all of the time? I mean, this is a pretty big accusation to lob at an unnamed enemy. But see, you get let off the hook through what I'd call intellectual dishonesty because you're not saying what the topics are or who is discussing them incorrectly. You're creating an evidence Mad Libs, allowing each individual audience member to fill in the blanks according to what parts of culture they feel most cynical about. You're using vagueness to build argument while dodging specifics. Specifics that could later be refuted by facts. Don't you see how that's kind of disingenuous?
We appear to be driving ourselves crazy. Actually crazy. As in incapable of coming into contact with reality. Unable to distinguish fact from fiction. And then becoming totally destabilized by our own powers of imagination and confirmation bias. And then lashing out at one another on that basis.
It's as if you're describing yourself and what you're about to do here. I'm sorry. That was a lowball. Why don't you pick the next topic?
So, I'd like to talk about the current moment and the current social unrest and its possible political implications and other cultural developments, and suggest what it might take to pull back from the brink here.
Okay, but can we pinky swear that you'll actually suggest what it might take to pull back from the brink by the end of this debate? And Sam, it doesn't count if you just say in your final few sentences, we must pull back from the brink. No, you've got to actually describe what the brink is. Because I really don't know. Is it the brink of progress? The brink of societal collapse? And don't just hint at things from time to time. You gotta fully outline what the title of your podcast actually means.
I've been watching our country seem to tear itself apart for weeks now.
Are you referring to the BLM protests? What do you mean by this? It feels rather inflammatory to call mostly peaceful protests a country tearing itself apart.
And I've been resisting the temptation to say anything of substance. Not because I haven't had anything to say, but because of my perception of the danger, frankly. And if I feel that way, given the pains I've taken to insulate myself against those kinds of concerns, I know that almost anyone with a public platform must be terrified. Journalists and editors and executives, celebrities, everyone has to be terrified that they might take a wrong step here and never recover.
Elaborating on your point, journalists, executives, celebrities, what do they all have in common? They have the overwhelming privilege of an outsized megaphone, right? And if they are indeed terrified, what are they terrified of? Losing their megaphone? They're terrified of becoming what? The rest of us? This is actually something I'd love to talk with you further about in a larger conversation surrounding so-called cancel culture.
This is really unhealthy, right? Not just for individuals, but for society. Because again, all we have between us and the total breakdown of civilization is a series of successful conversations.
Okay. What, in your view, is a successful conversation? Because there are lots of conversations happening. Conversations on the left, conversations on the right, conversations between the left and the right, conversations about conversations between the left and the right, conversations having nothing at all to do with the left and the right. Again, without any supporting evidence, this is just another example that is not based in reality. And the total breakdown of civilization, that's an egregious example of a hasty generalization fallacy.
Of course, normal life for many millions of Americans was nothing like a paradise. And the disparities in wealth and health and opportunity we've gotten used to in this country, and that so much of our politics and ways of doing business seem to take for granted, are just unconscionable. Right? There is no excuse for this kind of inequality in the richest country on earth. And what we're seeing now is clearly a response to that. But it's a confused and confusing response. And worse, it's a response that is systematically silencing honest conversation. And this makes it dangerous.
All right, we're going to need some evidence of honest conversation being silenced. Also, what do you define as honest conversation? Are there dishonest conversations happening that are not being silenced? Lastly, proclaiming an unclear group is dangerous is a clear example of creating a boogeyman, which, as I'm sure you know, in debate is a logical fallacy. I'd also like to take this time to mention the business called Sam Harris is doing fine. If you define honest conversation as the conversations you're having and publishing, then there is no real argument that honest conversation is being silenced. Your opinions and conversations are coming in loud and clear. As of this recording, over 600,000 people have listened to Can We Pull Back from the Brink on YouTube alone, and doubtless many more thousands on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. How can it not be intellectually dishonest to claim with any kind of sincerity that you or others like you are being silenced? Anyway, I digress. Why don't you tell me a little bit more about what you think it is you're seeing?
This isn't just politics and human suffering on display. It's philosophy. It's ideas about truth and about what it means to say that something is true. What we're witnessing in our streets and online and in the impossible conversations we're attempting to have with one another in our private lives is a breakdown in epistemology. How does anyone figure out what's going on in the world? What is real? If we can't agree about what is real, or likely to be real, we will never agree about how we should live together. And the problem is, we're stuck with one another.
Yes, I think we agree on this.
In the most concrete terms, what we're experiencing is widespread social unrest in response to what is widely believed to be an epidemic of lethal police violence directed at the black community by racist cops and racist policies. And this unrest has drawn a counter-response from law enforcement, much of which, ironically, is guaranteed to exacerbate the problem of police violence, both real and perceived. And many of the videos we've seen of the police cracking down on peaceful protesters are hideous. Some of this footage has been unbelievable. And this is one of the many vicious circles we have to find a way to interrupt.
It would be nice if you provided some ideas about how we could disrupt cycles of violence, but instead you seem more interested in prophesying imminent doom.
And it's important to keep in mind that with the presidential election coming in November, the stakes are really high. As most of you know, I consider 4 more years of Trump to be an existential threat to our democracy. And I believe the last 2 weeks have been very good for him, politically, even when everything else has seemed to go very badly for him. I know the polls don't say this. A large majority of people seem to disapprove of his handling of the crisis so far. But I think we all know now to take polls with a grain of salt. Right? There's a very real problem of preference falsification, especially in an environment of intense social pressure. People will often say what they think is politically acceptable, and then think or say or do something very different in private, like when they're alone in a voting booth.
So I agree that preference falsification could be a real phenomena, even though there's scant little research on the topic. But logically, we can't deduce whether or not or how BLM and the protests will affect the election outright, because these factors could conceivably swing it in either direction. Or they could pull equal for and against voters, effectively canceling any preference falsification bump. Some things to note. A majority of people feel that protesters' anger is justified, even if their actions may not be. Black Lives Matter has seen a positive 28-point change across all voters. When you say, especially in an environment of intense social pressure, I assume you're alluding to BLM and adjacent social discord. So you're implying that people secretly disagree with BLM and identity politics and actually agree with you on this topic, even though polls suggest the opposite, and will secretly vote for Trump because of it. Studies show that peaceful protests help Democratic candidates, while violent ones help GOP candidates. But even the '92 LA riots saw a huge surge of liberal voter turnout. I'm confident that removing Trump will require a combination of targeted canvassing in key battleground states and reducing voter suppression. And you can get involved. Go to votesaveamerica.com and fairfight2020.com.
And think about the politics of this. Endless imagery of people burning and looting independent businesses that were struggling to survive during this pandemic.
What independent businesses are you talking about?
And seeing the owners of these businesses beaten by mobs cannot be good for the cause of social justice. Looting and burning businesses and assaulting their owners isn't social justice. It isn't even social protest.
The rioting and looting in LA was on nearly all corporate retailers, who can definitely take the hit. The vast majority of affected businesses in Minneapolis are listed as having suffered minor property damage, aka a bit of graffiti on a window or a wall. I'm not sure what business owners you're referring to when saying they were beaten by mobs, But this is certainly part of an unfounded narrative being peddled by conservatives. While looting can most certainly lead to violence, the amount this actually happened is nebulous. And don't try to tell me it's not a form of social protest. It most definitely is a form of social protest. It couldn't be more a form of social protest. Let me read you a quick quote I pulled up from Wikipedia. Quote, historically, riots have occurred due to poverty, unemployment, poor living conditions, governmental oppression, taxation or conscription, conflicts between ethnic groups, the outcome of a sporting event, or frustration with legal channels through which to air grievances. End quote.
It's crime.
But Sam, isn't a crime only a crime because people in power legislated that it be considered a crime? Maybe rioting is illegal because riots classically protest against the people in power, aka the people who decide what is and isn't a crime?
And having imagery of these crimes that highlight black involvement circulate endlessly on Fox News and on social media cannot be good for the black community.
Oh yeah, because of white people's perception of black people. That's what you mean, isn't it? Gotta look good for the white people. I don't understand why you'd frame this as how this looks on Fox News. Fox News will make anything look like a war. There's been a war on Christmas for 15 years, according to Fox News.
And there are now calls to defund and even to abolish the police. Now, this may be psychologically understandable when you've spent half the day on Twitter watching videos of cops beating peaceful protesters. Those videos are infuriating, and I'll have a lot more to say about police violence in a minute. But if you think a society without cops is a society you would want to live in, you have lost your mind.
Now, this is extremely intellectually dishonest. You're quite literally inventing the education, attitude, perspective, experiences, and understanding of policing that abolitionists have. By saying something like that, you display absolutely no comprehension for what the people calling for defunding and or abolishing the police are actually asking for. And if you don't know what it is they actually want, well, I highly encourage you to do some research.
Giving a monopoly on violence to the state is just about the best thing we have ever done as a species.
Ew, Sam, gross.
It ranks right up there with keeping our shit out of our food.
Ugh, that's somehow even more gross.
Having a police force that can deter crime and solve crimes when they occur.
I assume you mean after they occur, and poorly at that.
And deliver violent criminals to a functioning justice system.
Functioning is not the word I would use.
Is the necessary precondition for almost anything else we value in society.
What? So many things you're either ignoring or don't know here. Do you not know that policing is a relatively new institution? I know you hate religion, but that served as a pretty effective crime prevention system for a hell of a lot longer than police have been around. Not saying we should bring back religion as the dominant peacekeeper in society, but just making a blanket statement that the criminal justice system is a necessary precondition for anything we value in society is wildly intellectually dishonest.
Now, we need police reform, of course, right? There are serious questions to ask about the culture of policing and its hiring practices and training and the militarization of so many police forces and outside oversight and how police departments deal with corruption, the way the police unions keep bad cops on the job. And yes, the problem of racist cops.
But not systemic racism? Or that the police are fundamentally a racist organization?
But the idea that any serious person thinks that we can do without the police.
Just want to flag that non-serious people are people too.
Or that less trained and less vetted cops will magically be better than more trained and more vetted ones.
Who is arguing for this? Yet another instance of magically conjuring an enemy and their position. I'm going to start calling you Sam the King of Strawman Harris.
This just reveals that our conversation on these topics has run completely off the rails.
As far as I know, you've never, at least publicly, spoken to a critical race theorist or police and or prison abolitionist. Yes or no? Is that true?
Yes, we should give more resources to community services.
This is what abolitionists want.
Sure, we should have psychologists and social workers make first contact with the homeless or the mentally ill.
This is what abolitionists want.
Perhaps we're giving cops jobs they shouldn't be doing.
This is exactly what abolitionists are saying. And get this, the police are saying it too.
All of that makes sense to rethink.
Honestly, seems like you've got a lot of common ground with abolitionists.
But the idea that what we're witnessing now is a matter of the cops being over-resourced, that we've given them too much training.
What? They barely get any training.
That we've made the job too attractive.
No one is saying that.
So that the people we're recruiting are of too high a quality. That doesn't make any sense.
Sam, that's because it's a straw man argument you literally just made up.
That's where democratic politics goes to die. And again, what is alarming about this is that this woke analysis of the breakdown of law and order will only encourage an increasingly authoritarian response and the acceptance of that response on the part of many millions of Americans. What's happening is that no one wants to say or even think anything that makes anyone uncomfortable.
You've actually already proven this to be untrue. BLM and protesters are saying defund the police, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable, including yourself. And that's just one example.
Certainly not anyone who has more wokeness points than they do. It's just become too dangerous.
The only thing that's dangerous is to be intellectually dishonest in service of a racist ideology that upholds the status quo, aka white male supremacy.
I mean, there are people being fired for tweeting "All Lives Matter." Hashtag "All Lives Matter" in the current environment is being read as a naked declaration of white supremacy.
The history of hashtag All Lives Matter and its more insidious cousin hashtag Blue Lives Matter is steeped in racism and white supremacy.
A soccer player on the LA Galaxy was fired for something his wife tweeted.
And that something his wife tweeted was a photo urging police to kill protesters, in addition to a racist meme. Come on, Sam, you can do better than this. Hashtag intellectual dishonesty.
The problem with the protests is that they are animated to a remarkable degree by confusion and misinformation. And I'll explain why I think that's the case. And of course, this will be controversial. And needless to say, many people will consider the color of my skin to be disqualifying here. And I could have invited any number of great black intellectuals onto this podcast to make these points for me. But that struck me as a form of cowardice. Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Coleman Hughes, Camille Foster. These guys might not agree with everything I'm about to say, but any one of them could walk the tightrope I'm now stepping out on far more credibly than I can.
I think it's important to note that there's not a whole lot of diversity of opinions in that group. I'm not gonna lie, this feels a little look at all my black friends. Don't you think?
But you see, that's part of the problem.
So we agree.
Right? The perception that the color of a person's skin,
Oh, back on that.
or even his life experience, matters for this discussion is a pernicious illusion. Yet for the discussion we really need to have, the color of a person's skin, and even his life experience, simply does not matter. It cannot matter. We have to break the spell that the politics of identity has cast over everything.
But this is a straw man argument. Who is telling you you can't talk about this topic? There's a difference between telling someone they're wrong and telling them they're not allowed to speak. It's the difference between criticism and cancellation. It seems to me like you're setting up an imaginary enemy so as to artificially infuse more meaning, courage, and power into what you're about to say. But please, continue. I'd love to be proven wrong.
And the truth is, we have made considerable progress on the problem of racism in America. And this isn't 1920, and it isn't 1960. We had a two-term black president. We have black congressmen and women. We have black mayors and black chiefs of police. There are major cities, like Detroit and Atlanta, going on their fifth or sixth consecutive black mayor. Having more black people in positions of real power in what is still a majority white society is progress on the problem of racism. And the truth is, it might not even solve the problem we're talking about.
It's like you secretly agree with abolitionists and critical race theorists, because this is what abolitionists and critical race theorists have been saying for years, decades.
I mean, when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, virtually everyone who could have been held accountable for his death was black.
Black Lives Matter LA has been fighting to have the DA, Jackie Lacey, a black woman, removed for nearly 3 years. People are first and foremost upset at the system, not at how many black people are in positions of power, although some are upset about that as well.
The problem of police misconduct and reform is complicated, as we're about to see. But obviously there's more work to do on the problem of racism. And more important, there is much more work to do to remedy the inequalities in our society that are so correlated with race, and will still be correlated with race even after the last racist has been driven from our shores.
I'm really starting to think you're secretly an abolitionist.
The question of how much of today's inequality is due to existing racism, whether racist people or racist policies, is a genuinely difficult question to answer. And to answer it, we need to distinguish the past from the present.
It would be really great at this point to look at the work of historians, critical theorists, criminal justice activists, and people who have been living this work for decades, because distinguishing the past from the present, while also understanding that it's all connected and causal, is precisely what they do. But no, those people can't be trusted. They're part of the brainwashed leftist orthodoxy. But don't worry, I've got a funny feeling you're going to figure it all out on your lonesome, aren't you?
So, with that as preamble, let's return to the tragic death of George Floyd.
We've only just finished preamble? So far, you've said nothing of substance. It's all been boogeymen and vagaries. A paradoxical mix of claiming to agree with social justice goals and then in the same breath claiming the movement is somehow destroying society. Very well, moving on to amble.
As I said, I believe that any sane person who watches that video will feel that they have witnessed a totally unjustified killing. So people of any race are right to be horrified by what happened there. But now I want to ask a few questions, and I want us to try to consider them dispassionately. And I really want you to watch your mind while you do this, because there are very likely a few tripwires installed there, and I'm about to hit some of them. So just do your best to remain calm.
I think you're assuming a lot about your audience. You're also setting up a false test. It goes like this. If you can listen to what Sam's about to say without your wires getting tripped, you're on the right side of this thing, the smart and rational side. But if your wires do get tripped, well then you're one of the cultists and you better get your brain clean because you're thinking irrationally.
Does the killing of George Floyd prove that we have a problem of racism in the United States?
No, I don't believe so.
Does it even suggest that we have a problem of racism in the United States?
Yes, I think it does.
In other words, do we have reason to believe that had Floyd been white, he wouldn't have died in a similar way?
I think I reject the premise. You can't play that game because he wasn't white. Would he have been at the grocery store in that neighborhood trying to cash a fake $20 bill if he'd had been white? Would the police have been called on him? Would he have resisted arrest? Would he have been physically restrained in the same way? Would he have had the exact same pre-existing health conditions?
Do the dozen or so other videos that have emerged in recent years of black men being killed by cops, do they prove or even suggest that there is an epidemic of lethal police violence directed especially at black men, and that this violence is motivated by racism?
Again, prove? No. Suggest? Yes.
Now, most people seem to think that the answers to these questions are so obvious that even to pose them, as I just did, is obscene. And the answer is yes. And it's a yes that now needs to be shouted in the streets.
Before you even get started going down the path I know you're about to get going on, let's get one thing straight. Less police brutality and less police killings is good for everyone, and abolitionists have been consistently saying this for decades. Less humans dying and or being criminalized is the goal. I do, however, completely agree that BLM's message is hindered by largely ignoring cases where white men like Tony Timpa were killed by police. Removing the mentally ill from society is just as much a part of policing's sordid history as racism. According to a 2020 New Republic article, quote, mentally ill, substance-dependent, sexually delinquent, and poor whites have long been suspect in the eyes of the law, because such persons intensify anxieties about black and non-white others conquering the white race. There may be no clearer example of this than in the case of eugenics, a still reverberating set of pseudoscientific ideas that come to the fore in the early 20th century, leading to tens of thousands of supposedly inferior whites being targeted for forcible sterilization and segregation." End quote.
The problem, however, is that if you take even 5 minutes to look at the data on crime and police violence, the answer really appears to be no, in every case, albeit with one important caveat. I'm not talking about how the police behaved in 1970 or even 1990.
The Washington Post actually put out a massive compilation of studies, research, and data titled, "There's Racial Bias in Our Police Systems. Here's the Overwhelming Proof." I found it within 5 minutes, I swear.
But in the last 25 years, violent crime has come down significantly in the U.S., and so has the police use of deadly force.
Well, it's fallen in all Western countries at the same rates. So whatever is causing it to drop, because nobody really knows, it doesn't have anything to do with changes in American policing policies.
The police use more deadly force against white people, both in terms of absolute numbers and in terms of their contribution to crime and violence in our society.
You're conveniently leaving out relative numbers and the lifetime risk, which is more than twice as likely to be killed by police. Also, contribution to crime is extremely loaded. The definition of crime and what leads to high crime rates must be explored.
But the public perception is, of course, completely different. I mean, in a city like Los Angeles, 2019 was a 30-year low for police shootings. Think about that.
Right, but the key word here is shootings. George Floyd was not killed by a gun. George Floyd was killed by a non-lethal immobilization technique. Non-lethal.
How many people are killed each year in America by cops? Now, if you don't know, guess. Right? See if you have any intuition for these numbers. Because your intuitions determine how you interpret horrific videos of the sort we saw coming out of Minneapolis. The answer for many years running is about 1,000. Okay, 1,000 people are killed by cops in America each year. There are about 50 to 60 million encounters between civilians and cops each year, and about 10 million arrests. That's down from a high of over 14 million arrests annually through the 90s. So of the 10 million occasions where a person attracts the attention of the police,
I'd like to note how you frame it as the person doing the attracting.
the police decide to make an arrest. About 1,000 of those people die as a result. I'm sure a few people get killed when there's no arrest attempted, but that has to be a truly tiny number. So, without knowing anything else about the situation, if the cops decide to arrest you, it is reasonable to think that your chance of dying is around 1 in 10,000.
For reference, 1 out of 10,000 is also the odds of committing suicide, which is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S.
Now, of course, in the United States, it's higher than it is in other countries. So I'm not saying this number is acceptable, but it is what it is for a reason, as we're about to see. Now, there are a few generic points I want to make before we get further into these data, and they should be uncontroversial.
Unfortunately, data on policing is famously lackluster. From cops not reporting out of laziness and or corruption to mismanagement to flat-out covering up police criminality, data has been skewed heavily in favor of the police for its entire existence. A national data set established by the FBI in 2019, for example, contains data from only about 40% of U.S. law enforcement officers. Data submission by officers and agencies is voluntary, which many researchers see as part of the problem. Even Jim Comey thinks lack of crime data is ridiculous.
First, it's almost certainly the case that of these 1,000 officer-caused deaths each year, some are entirely justified. Right? It may even be true that most are entirely justified.
Based on what?
And some are entirely unjustified. And some are much harder to judge. And that will be true next year and the year after that.
Right, but the goal is to continually reduce these deaths, both unjustified and justified. Shouldn't we strive for fewer deaths each year, even though we know there will still be some deaths the year after?
Of the unjustified killings, there are vast differences between them. Many have nothing in common but for the fact that a cop killed someone unnecessarily.
That is quite literally the point.
It might have been a terrible misunderstanding, or incompetence, or just bad luck. In certain cases, it could be a cop who decides to murder someone because he's become enraged, or he's just a psychopath.
Or she. Let's not forget the lady psychopaths.
Right. And it is certainly possible that racial bias accounts for some number of these unjustified killings. Another point that should be uncontroversial, but may sound a little tone-deaf in the current environment, after we've been inundated with videos of police violence in response to these protests. But this has to be acknowledged whenever we're discussing this topic. Cops have a very hard job.
Well, I agree, but to put it into perspective, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Census of Fatal Occupational Injuries program, police and sheriff patrol officers have the 16th most dangerous job in America. That's less dangerous than mechanics, farmers, and truck drivers, just to name a few.
In fact, in the current environment, they have an almost impossible job.
And that is an almost impossible statement to back up in any kind of meaningful way.
If you're making 10 million arrests every year, some number of people will decide not to cooperate. Now, there are many reasons for this. A person could be mentally ill, or drunk, or on drugs. And of course, rather often, the person is an actual criminal who simply doesn't want to be arrested.
All right. First off, a person who is mentally ill, drunk, or on drugs does not deserve to receive bodily harm or die for any of these reasons. And a person experiencing these conditions is more likely to make an irrational choice, such as resisting arrest. A cop is not well trained to communicate with a person experiencing these conditions and is more likely to use force against the person once they are resisting arrest. Therefore, in order to reduce the likelihood of bodily harm or death against a person who is mentally ill, drunk, or on drugs, a cop should not be the civil servant sent to respond to the scene. Second, we must ask why a person would want to resist arrest. Most likely, it's because they do not want to go to jail. Knowing the risk of bodily harm and yet still resisting arrest would lead one to think that for people resisting arrest, there is an awareness that they are making a life or death decision. Getting arrested means very different things for different people. Getting arrested can give you a record, and that record can prevent you from getting a job, even if it was for something later deemed acceptable, like marijuana use. Being arrested while poor is also life-altering because if you can't afford bail, being charged means losing your job because you have to wait trial in jail. Having a prior or being on probation would be a strong incentive to want to resist arrest. What populations are more likely to have priors and therefore not want to be taken into custody? Why do certain populations have more priors? Could it have anything to do with historically unfair policing and sentencing? Could it have anything to do with systemic poverty and oppression? Without the necessary resources, education, and opportunities to achieve holistic community fiscal enrichment, how could it be otherwise that a community wouldn't have more priors or more direct experience of the horrors of the justice system, leading to a collective perceived distrust and fear of police and the custodial process, and therefore more arrest resists?
And among innocent people, and perhaps this is getting more common these days, a person might feel that resisting arrest is the right thing to do, ethically or politically, or perhaps as a matter of affirming his identity. After all, put yourself in his shoes. He did nothing wrong, right? Why are the cops arresting him? I don't know if we have data on the numbers of people who resist arrest by race, but I can well imagine that if it's common for African Americans to believe that the only reason they have been singled out for arrest is due to racism on the part of the police, that could lead to greater levels of noncompliance, which seems very likely to lead to more unnecessary injury and death.
Okay, cool. You're kind of agreeing with my previous point, but it seems like you're unwilling to go all the way. Was that a fair assessment? It's like you're stopping at blacks think they've been racially targeted, but not going as far as saying blacks are racially targeted.
And this is certainly one reason why it's wise to have the racial composition of a police force mirror that of the community it's policing. Now, unfortunately, there's no evidence that this reduces lethal violence from the side of the police.
Wait, no, you just strawman yourself. Something can't be both wise and unfortunately have had its premise proven untrue.
In fact, the evidence we have suggests that Black and Hispanic cops are more likely to shoot Black and Hispanic suspects than white cops are.
I mean, there's mixed evidence to support this. A study from the National Bureau of Economic Research, for example, shows that while white and black officers use gun force at similar rates in white and racially mixed neighborhoods, white officers are 5 times as likely as black officers to use gun force in predominantly black neighborhoods.
But it would surely change the perception of the community that racism is the likely explanation for police behavior, which itself might reduce conflict.
I think you're confounding interpersonal racism with systemic racism. While there might be interpersonal racism here and there, BLM, critical theorists, and the like are fighting against systemic racism. And blacks can be complicit in systemic racism too. Jackie Lacey, for example, has been consistently accused of complicity in systemic racism.
If you haven't trained with firearms under stress, if you don't know how suddenly situations can change, if you haven't experienced how quickly another person can close the distance on you, and how little time you have to decide to draw your weapon, if you don't know how hard it is to shoot a moving target, or even a stationary one, when your heart is beating out of your chest, you very likely have totally unreasonable ideas about what we can expect from cops in situations like these.
So Sam just showed me 3 videos to back up his point. You can find them in the Medium companion piece. All 3 of these videos are suspects armed with knives, and all end up getting shot with guns by the police. How are the cops not trained to subdue a person with a knife without killing them, or without shooting them? In the first 2 videos, the police escalate the situation. They could have kept their distance until more police arrived, or brought in a mental health crisis responder to calm the situation. Instead, they just yell, "Don't do it, man! Drop the knife!" over and over. Clearly, that tactic is not working. The third video depicts a black man wielding a knife and charging a police officer after apparently crashing into the officer's cruiser. The cop then shoots him. There are a couple ways to look at this. If the police officer wasn't a police officer, this wouldn't have happened if the man was intentionally targeting him due to his occupation. If the crash was accidental and he attacked the officer because he was scared he was now facing arrest or jailing, again, the situation wouldn't have escalated if those conclusions did not exist. And finally, if the man would still have attacked a non-cop person he rear-ended, and the non-cop person didn't have a gun on them, well, now we're in a totally new scenario where we're either talking about Second Amendment rights or mental health in this country or the efficacy of police involvement after the fact. So, this man was obviously mentally unstable via the simple logic, don't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? So in a world without police, this man wouldn't have had the target to crash into, and if he did do something dangerous, a therapist would have showed up and calmed him, gained his trust, and gotten him the medical attention he deserved.
And there's another fact that looms over all this like the angel of death. Literally. Most cops do not get the training they need. They don't get the hand-to-hand training they need. They don't have good skills with which to subdue people without harming them. All you need to do is watch YouTube videos of botched arrests to see this.
All right, for those listening, Sam just showed me another video. I 100% agree. Also, I just want to point out that in this video and in the Rayshard Brooks killing, the police and the suspect are calm up until the point of being taken into custody. This is the point at which people try to escape, not the point at which they threaten the safety of the police. The police then use force to attempt to subdue the suspect, and so the suspect reacts with counterforce. This escalates until the suspect is, as in the case of Rayshard Brooks, dead, or has escaped, as appears to be the case in this video. I learned he was later arrested and sentenced to 53 years in prison. So, I'm not saying what is right, but this is the order of operations here. I say this to bring up the relevant point that many police killings occur as a result of the decision to take a suspect into custody. So perhaps figuring out a way to take a suspect into custody without the use of force would reduce police killings. If the suspect had hostages, you would call in a negotiator to get the suspects to surrender themselves with the least amount of hostage injury. What if we treated all suspects this way? What if we imagined that the suspect was a person's mind and the hostage was their body? What if the goal was to get the person to willingly surrender themselves? Who would be better at achieving this goal? A poorly trained cop or a highly trained therapist or social worker?
And sometimes the cop will be white and the victim will be black.
Right, but the point is they're more likely to be black. That's the whole point of this.
We have 10 million arrests each year. And we now live in a panopticon where practically everything is videotaped.
Sam, the thing is, there are so many police killings that don't go viral. On average, 2 people have been shot to death by police every day of 2020. We're not seeing 2 videos go viral every day.
The George Floyd video, while even more disturbing to watch, is harder to interpret. Now, I don't know anything about Derek Chauvin, the cop who knelt on his neck. It's quite possible he's a terrible person who should have never been a cop. He seems to have a significant number of complaints against him, though as far as I know, the details of those complaints haven't been released. And he might be a racist on top of being a bad cop. Or he might be a guy who was totally in over his head and thought you could restrain someone indefinitely by keeping a knee on their neck. I don't know. I'm sure more facts will come out. But whoever he is, I find it very unlikely that he was intending to kill George Floyd. I mean, think about it. He was surrounded by irate witnesses and being filmed. Unless he was aspiring to become the most notorious murderer in human history, it seems very unlikely he was intending to commit murder in that moment. It's possible, of course, but it doesn't seem like the likeliest explanation for his behavior.
No one thinks this. What people are angry at is that police are allowed to detain people over trivial things like trying to pass off a fake $20 bill at the grocery store or driving with a broken taillight, and then the police are allowed to kneel on the person's neck for 9 minutes or escalate a situation into a shooting or inject them with ketamine or strangle them in a chokehold or whatever thing accidentally kills them. And if it weren't for an innocent bystander recording it on their phone and that video somehow going viral and fomenting worldwide outrage, those police officers would most likely get away with it. That's what people are angry about.
This is almost certainly what happened in the case of Eric Garner. It seems that half the people on Earth believe they witnessed a cop choke Eric Garner to death in that video. That does not appear to be what happened. When Eric Garner is saying, "I can't breathe," he's not being choked. He's being held down on the pavement by several officers. Now, being forced down on your stomach under the weight of several people can kill a person, right? Especially someone with lung or heart disease. In the case of Eric Garner, it is absolutely clear that the cop who briefly attempted to choke him was no longer choking him. If you doubt that, watch the video again.
Yeah, I really don't understand what point you're driving at here or why. Are you saying chokeholds are fine, but back weight is not? Is that the point? If so, you're just plain wrong. You've provided no evidence other than your own misguided interpretation of the video. Are you now suddenly an expert on chokeholds in medical science? I'm sorry to break it to you, but neuroscientist does not a medical doctor make. According to a 2019 Washington Post article, the cause of Garner's death was compression of the neck, chokehold, listing chest compression, asthma, and hypertension as contributing factors. Where the video showed Garner flailing on the ground, the medical examiner saw air hunger, Garner's body reacting to the desperate need for oxygen. That began a lethal cascade, the medical examiner said, triggering an asthma attack that in turn led to cardiac arrest. So, it very much was the chokehold that killed him.
I obviously have no idea what was in the minds of the cops in Minneapolis, and perhaps we'll learn more at trial. And perhaps there'll be a tape of Chauvin using the N-word in another context, and that'll bring a credible allegation of racism into the case. And it seems to me that Chauvin is going to have a very hard time making sense of his behavior. But most people who saw that video believe they have witnessed, with their own eyes, beyond any possibility of doubt, a racist cop intentionally murder an innocent man. That's not what that video necessarily shows.
Is this really what you're setting out to prove? That Chauvin was not an overt racist who set out to murder a black man that day? If so, I hate to break it to you, but you're woefully missing the point. The point being that it is a system of oppression
built out of racism that allows police to detain individuals for trivial infractions who are black or Latinx more often than white or Asian, and then escalate situations towards forced custody against populations who are more likely to resist that outcome. And then police are allowed to use controversial restraint techniques with potentially deadly consequences, and more often on black and Latinx men, or shoot them over non-threatening situations. And more than likely, these officers will not face any negative repercussions in response to these deaths. This is what BLM is protesting. This is what activists want addressed. This is why people want to defund the police and unbundle their responsibilities.
People have to stop resisting arrest. This may seem obvious, but judging from most of these videos and from the public reaction to them, this must be a totally arcane piece of information. When a cop wants to take you into custody, you don't get to decide whether or not you should be arrested. When a cop wants to take you into custody, for whatever reason, it's not a negotiation. And if you turn it into a wrestling match, you're very likely to get injured or killed.
I know you're going to hate this, but this really is an extremely privileged position to take. I'm honestly disappointed in your seeming inability to think through this kind of thing empathetically. Let's do a thought experiment. If the cops showed up because you got caught trying to pass off a forged $20 bill because you couldn't afford cigarettes after losing your job due to coronavirus shutdowns, and now you're looking at imprisonment for up to 3 years, or a fine of up to $5,000 because you've been arrested a handful of times, starting with that first time you got caught delivering less than an ounce of cocaine to a friend and then couldn't get a job after your release because you were now an ex-con, so you did some robberies for a little money and got arrested again, and then after your release, the cycle continued, and sometimes police would make sweeps through the low-rent complex you were living in, which was all you could afford, and would end up detaining a large number of men, including yourself, furthering the carceral cycle, and now all of a sudden you think you're going to understand how to behave around cops so as to keep yourself safe? That's your big take, Sam? George Floyd was saying out loud that he was feeling claustrophobic and stiffened up before getting into that cop car. That was the offense that got him killed. To go back to Tony Timpa's killing, add to the mix that you're drunk or high or have a mental illness or you're just having a really bad day, you might get scared. You might make a split-second decision to try to run or fight. And that's the beginning of the end for you. Tony Timpa made that decision while his hands were already cuffed behind his back. For someone who claims to not believe in free will, you certainly like to victim blame a lot.
Now, you might think that cops shouldn't carry guns.
I do think this.
Right. Why can't we just be like England?
Yes. Why can't we?
That's a point that can be debated.
All right. Love it. Let's do it.
But it requires considerable thought in a country where there are over 300 million guns in circulation.
Wait, what?
The United States is not England.
That's it? How about a rain check on this one?
Again, really focus on what is happening when a cop is attempting to arrest a person. It's not up to you to decide whether or not you should be arrested. I mean, does it matter that you know that you didn't do anything wrong? No.
The thing is, black people are disproportionately arrested for minor infractions all the time, and it can ruin their lives.
And how could that fact be effectively communicated in the moment by your not following police commands? I'm going to ask that again. How could the fact that you're innocent, that you're not a threat to the cop, that you're not about to suddenly attack him or produce a weapon of your own, how could those things be effectively communicated at the moment he's attempting to arrest you by your resisting arrest?
Sam, it's like you're not even listening to me.
And unless you called the cops yourself, you never really know what situation you're in.
So like when Tony Timpa called the cops on himself and then those very same cops killed him? I'm not gonna lie. I don't think your logic's holding up.
If I'm walking down the street, I don't know if a cop who's approaching me didn't just get a call that some guy who looks like Ben Stiller just committed an armed robbery.
I love this joke. I really do. But the thing is, this analogy only works if you swap out Ben Stiller for any white man regardless of clothes, height, age, or weight. You know what I mean?
The main problem with using individual cases where black men and women have been killed by cops to conclude that there's an epidemic of racist police violence in our society is that you can find nearly identical cases of white suspects being killed by cops. And there are actually more of them.
But actually, there are not more of them per demographic population. By one estimate, black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police during their lifetime. And in another study, black people who were fatally shot by police seem to be twice as likely as white people to be unarmed.
So this is also a distortion in the media, right? The media is not showing us videos of white people being killed by cops. Activists are not demanding that they do this.
But Sam, you just presented 2 examples of white people being killed by cops from the John McWhorter challenge. Black Lives Matter stems from the premise that in the US, black lives are treated like they don't matter. So raising up the names of those people who have died is acknowledging that they are in fact people. White people know they matter. So it's less of a thing. Like, you've already acknowledged white people have privilege. So that's the whole point of all of this. Why don't we lift up the names of white people killed by cops? That's the long way of saying all lives matter. It just misses the point of everything.
I'm sure white supremacists talk about this stuff a lot.
They sure are.
In terms of the story we're telling ourselves in the mainstream, we're not actually talking about the data on lethal police violence.
I don't understand who you're accusing of not talking about the data. Because lots of people are talking about the data. For example, here's an LA Times database called the Los Angeles Police Killings Database. Here's a Washington Post article entitled, "There's Racial Bias in Our Police Systems. Here's the Overwhelming Proof." Here's a New York Times piece, "Police Killings of Blacks. Here is what the data say." And sorry to spoil your read, but it says, quote, "The data is unequivocal. Police killings are a race problem. African Americans are being killed disproportionately by a wide margin, and police bias may be responsible." End quote.
So back to the data. Again, cops kill around 1,000 people every year in the United States. About 25% are black. About 50% are white. Now, the data on police homicide are all over the place. The federal government does not have a single repository for data of this kind. But they've been pretty carefully tracked by outside sources, like the Washington Post, at least for the last 5 years or so.
If there is no data, except that compiled by the Washington Post, that is a problem. And it exists as a problem because police unions have been fighting accountability for decades. But just because the police don't want data to get out doesn't mean there isn't any, like what I just showed before with the LA Times, the New York Times, Washington Post.
Blacks are 13% of the population, but they commit at least 50% of the murders and other violent crimes.
Yeah, and why does that happen? Could it be all the other systemic racism? Maybe it's part of the same problem. Could it have anything to do with Jim Crow laws, generational poverty, bank loan restrictions, redlining, the crack epidemic, broken windows policing, 40 years of incarcerating 1 out of 3 black men, the school-to-prison pipeline, food deserts, drastic disparities in educational resources in black communities versus white communities? I mean, the list goes on and on.
If you have 13% of the population responsible for 50% of the murders, and in some cities committing 2/3 of all violent crime, what percent of police attention should it attract? I honestly don't know. But I'm pretty sure it's not just 13%. And given that the overwhelming majority of their victims are black, I'm pretty sure that most black people wouldn't set the dial at 13% either.
We've tried increasing police presence and budgets already with policies like Clinton's 1994 crime bill and later stop and frisk, and they've all been colossal failures. BLM is calling for reduced police budgets so that the surplus cash can be redirected towards education, social programs, housing, parks, mental health services, drug rehabilitation centers, food co-ops, and jobs, just to name a few of the services that would absolutely reduce crime, both violent and nonviolent.
And here we arrive somewhere near the core of the problem. The story of crime in America is overwhelmingly the story of black-on-black crime. It is also, in part, a story of black-on-white crime. But for more than a generation, it really has not been much of a story of white-on-black crime.
Okay, 2 things going on here. 1, crime goes hand in hand with poverty and lack of opportunity. 2, People are more likely to kill people they are in proximity to, and more likely to kill people they know than those they don't. While there have been periods of great wealth increase for blacks on the whole, there are still racially segregated areas of most cities that have high poverty and low opportunity. It's only logical that crime would happen in these areas to people who live in those areas.
And this type of violence is far more representative of the kind of violence the black community needs to worry about.
You know, BLM and activists are very worried about both kinds of violence, and they see hashtag defund the police as a solution to both problems.
And ironically, it's clear that one remedy for this violence would be effective policing.
Okay, a little math. Military occupation plus embargo on resources and opportunity equals disenfranchised population with widespread poverty and desperation, which always leads to more crime, not less.
But Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist whose work I once discussed with Glenn Lowry on the podcast, he studied police encounters involving black and white suspects and the use of force. His paper is titled, and this is from 2016, An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. And Fryer is black, and he went into this research with the expectation that the data would confirm that there's an epidemic of lethal police violence directed against black men, especially. But he didn't find that. However, he did find support for the idea that black people suffer more non-lethal violence at the hands of cops than whites do. So let's look at this.
And he concluded that, quote, racial differences in police use of nonviolent force has spillovers on myriad dimensions of racial inequality. If, for instance, blacks use their lived experience with police as evidence that the world is discriminatory, then it is easy to understand why black youth invest less in human capital, or black adults are more likely to believe discrimination is an important determination of economic outcomes. Black dignity matters, end quote. This is a direct quote from Fryer's paper.
The study examined data from 10 major police departments in Texas, Florida, and California. Generally, Fryer found that there's a 25% greater likelihood that the police would go hands-on black suspects than white ones, cuffing them or forcing them to the ground or using other non-lethal force.
Well, hold on a second. This study should not be looked at as dogma. If you're going to use a single study to prop up your entire argument, I'd like to flag that there is a healthy lineup of criticism of this study. The New York Times actually ran a nice piece where Freiland responds to many of those criticisms.
Specifically in New York City, in encounters where black and white citizens were matched for other characteristics, they found that cops were 17% more likely to go hands-on black suspects, 18% more likely to push them into a wall, 16% more likely to put them in handcuffs in a situation where they weren't being arrested, 18% more likely to push them to the ground, 25% more likely to use pepper spray or a baton, 19% more likely to draw their guns, and 24% more likely to point a gun at them.
Yeah, this is all stuff that BLM and activists are protesting about.
But Fryer also found that black suspects are around 25% less likely to be shot than white suspects are. And in the most egregious situations, where an officer was not first attacked, but nevertheless fired his weapon at a suspect, the police seem more likely to do this when the suspect is white.
Yeah, so there are seemingly conflicting studies on this. One study shows that black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police during their lifetime. And in another study, it is shown that black people who were fatally shot by police seem to be twice as likely as white people to be unarmed. I think I already talked about these studies.
Now, as I hope I've made clear, we need police reform, right? There's no question about this. And some of the recent footage of the police attacking the peaceful protests is totally outrageous. Nothing I just said should signify that I'm unaware of that. But racializing how we speak about the problem of police violence, where race isn't actually the relevant variable, again, think Tony Timpa.
Yeah, we get it. Tony Timpa is the smoking gun against the malevolent BLM conspiracy.
This has highly negative effects. First, it keeps us from talking about the real problems with police tactics.
It actually amplifies that conversation. There have been big policy moves already in response.
For instance, you take the recent case of Breonna Taylor, who was killed in a so-called no-knock raid of her home, as occasionally happens in this carnival of moral error we call the war on drugs. The police had the wrong address, and they kicked in the wrong door, and they wound up killing a totally innocent woman.
So this is a great example. Directly due to the public outrage over this, there's a new law, the Breonna Taylor Law, which will ban no-knock warrants in Louisville, Kentucky.
But the truth is, this had nothing to do with race. The problem is not, as some commentators have alleged, that it's not safe to be sleeping while black. The problem is that these no-knock raids are an obscenely dangerous way of enforcing despicably stupid laws. White people die under precisely these same circumstances, and very likely in greater numbers. I don't have data specifically on no-knock raids, but we can assume the ratio is probably conserved here.
So, according to the Wikipedia article on no-knock warrants, quote, half of the civilians killed were members of a minority. Of those subject to SWAT search warrants, 42% are black and 12% are Hispanic, end quote.
I mean, just think about how crazy this policy is in a nation where gun ownership is so widespread.
I think that's a great point, Sam.
I mean, if someone kicks in your door in the middle of the night and you're a gun owner, of course you're going to reach for your gun, right? That's why you have a gun in the first place. Now, unfortunately, the process of police reform isn't straightforward, and it's made more complicated by the kinds of things that are happening now. I mean, yes, we will be urging police reform in a very big way now. That seems clear. But Roland Fryer has also shown that investigations of cops in a climate where viral videos and racial politics are operating have dramatic effects and dramatically negative effects.
Yeah, you still almost entirely cited data from Roland Fryer, a single data scientist. A data scientist who is quite controversial and argued against.
I mean, who's going to want to be a cop now? I mean, who could be idealistic about occupying that role in society? It seems to me that the population of people who will become cops now will be more or less indistinguishable from the population of people who become prison guards.
Oh, what a generalization. I don't know what your imaginary population of people who become prison guards are, but you clearly don't think very highly of them.
I'm pretty sure there's a difference there.
Yeah, based on what?
I see no reason to doubt that African Americans get more attention from the cops. Though, honestly, given the distribution of crime in our society, I don't know what the alternative to that would be.
Have you heard about #CareNotCops?
And once the cops get involved, blacks are more likely to get roughed up, it seems, which is bad, right? But again, it's simply unclear that racism is the cause of that. And contrary to everyone's expectations, it seems that whites are more likely to get killed by cops.
No, again, not by demographic representation. A recent NIH NCBI study showed that, quote, victims were majority white at 52%, but disproportionately black at 32%, with a fatality rate 2.8 times higher among blacks than whites.
We have a problem here that read either way, you could tell a starkly racist narrative.
Sorry, what?
We need ethical, professional policing, of course, right? But the places with the highest crime in our society need the most of it. Is there any doubt about that? I mean, in a city like Milwaukee, blacks are 12 times more likely to get murdered than whites. And again, they're being killed by other African Americans nearly 100% of the time.
Lack of resources, plus lack of opportunity, plus overt and covert generational segregation equals crime proximity.
I think the lowest figure I've seen is 93% of the time. What should the police do about this? And what are they likely to do now? Now that our entire country has been convulsed over one horrific case of police misconduct.
Have you heard about #defund the police?
So we need to lower the temperature on this conversation and many other conversations, and to understand what is actually happening in our society.
Why do we need to lower the temperature on this? When things have a low temperature, less people are talking about them, less people are thinking and writing about them, politicians are less incentivized to do anything about them, and nothing changes.
But instead of doing this, we now have a whole generation of social activists who seem eager to play a game of chicken with the forces of chaos.
The forces of chaos? So what are we playing, Warhammer 40K right now?
There's a similar problem with Black Lives Matter. Though, happily, unlike Antifa, Black Lives Matter actually seems committed to peaceful protest, which is hugely important.
You know, Antifa is actually also largely committed to peaceful protest. Unless, of course, you're getting your information from Trump and Fox News.
So the problem I'm discussing is more ideological, and it's much bigger than Black Lives Matter. But BLM is the most visible symbol of this movement. And the wider issue is that we are in the midst of a moral panic, right? And it's been made possible by a near total unwillingness, particularly on the left, among people who value their careers and their livelihoods and their reputations, and have a legitimate fear of being hounded into oblivion online.
Wait, how many people do you think are supporting or not criticizing BLM online out of fear? Honest question.
So this is nearly everyone left of center, politically.
Everyone left of center? That's so many people.
People are simply refusing to speak honestly about the problem of race and racism in America.
Sam, if I may interject here, I feel like this is the crux of your argument. You're upset that it's controversial to disagree with Black Lives Matter. But here's the thing. Disagreeing with the liberal orthodoxy is your bread and butter. That's your brand. In a way, shouldn't you be happy it's controversial to disagree with Black Lives Matter? Maybe that's a bad faith position for me to take. Yeah, I would accept that criticism.
And we're making ourselves sick, right? We are damaging our society. And by protesting the wrong thing, even the slightly wrong thing, and unleashing an explosion of cynical criminality in the process, looting that doesn't even have a pretense of protest, the left is empowering Trump, whatever the polls currently show.
Honestly, not really sure how you feel so confident making that forecast.
And if we're worried about Trump's authoritarian ambitions, as I think we really should be, this is important to understand. I mean, he recently had what looked like paramilitary troops guarding the White House.
Whoa, are you saying it'll be Black Lives Matter's fault if Trump goes full dictator?
I don't know if we found out who those guys actually were, but that was genuinely alarming. But how are Democratic calls to abolish the police going to play in half the country that just watched so many cities getting looted?
Maybe we should be criticizing the way local news covered the extremely small incidents of looting instead of the overwhelming peaceful protests.
We have to vote Trump out of office to restore the integrity of our institutions.
I 100% agree. I would think that the largest movement in American history would be a great way to galvanize Democratic voters.
And we have to make the political case for major reforms to deal with the problem of inequality, a problem which affects the Black community most of all.
Do you not understand what activism is, or social justice?
We need police reform. We need criminal justice reform. We need tax reform. We need healthcare reform. We need environmental reform. We need all of these things and more. And to be just, these policies will need to reduce inequality in our society. And if we did this, African Americans would benefit, perhaps more than any other group. But it's not at all clear that progress along these dimensions primarily entails us finding and eradicating more racism in our society.
Well, here's a good primer for you, Sam, from the Brookings Institute. It's called Black Progress, How Far We've Come and How Far We Have to Go.
And just ask yourself, what would real progress on the problem of racism look like? What would utter progress look like?
So I did a quick Google and dropped 4 examples of what this could look like in the Medium post.
Well, here's what I think it would look like. More and more people, and ultimately all people, would care less and less, and ultimately not at all, about race. As I've said in various places, skin color would become like hair color in its political and moral significance, which is to say it would have none.
Yeah, so I think it would be more like the story of LGBTQIA plus fighting for and winning legal rights, gaining acceptance into the mainstream, celebrations of identity, for example, pride, and pushing for further progress like we've been seeing lately with trans rights and pronoun awareness. Let's not forget that pride started with a riot and led to considerable activism and hard-fought real-world change. These rights were unarguably won through identity politics.
So the question for the rest of us, those of us who want to build a world populated by human beings merely, the question is, how do we get there? How does racial difference become uninteresting? Can it become uninteresting by more and more people taking a greater interest in it? Can it become uninteresting by becoming a permanent political identity? Can it become uninteresting by having thousands of institutions whose funding, and therefore very survival, depends on it remaining interesting until the end of the world?
Again, yeah, I think a good scaffold is the LGBTQIA plus movement. They have achieved many political goals. Think HIV awareness and legal rights and mainstream acceptance. Think RuPaul, Pete Buttigieg, corporate-sponsored pride floats. But they're still pushing and still questioning themselves. For example, critiquing the privilege of white, cis, gay men over other queer identities, or analyzing pronouns. And it would be hard to argue that life has gotten worse for queer folk, yet many still take issue with the way things currently are. This is not evidence of the progress they've made being for the worse. On the contrary, it's evidence that progress is a process, something that keeps progressing until it gradually loses energy because it doesn't need to keep going anymore.
The real burden on the Black community is the continued legacy of inequality with respect to wealth and education and health and social order, levels of crime in particular, and the resulting levels of incarceration and single-parent families. And it seems very unlikely that these disparities, whatever their origin in the past, can be solved by focusing on the problem of lingering racism, especially where it doesn't exist.
Why, though? This is just a thing you thought, and now you're saying it like it's a fact.
And the current problem of police violence seems a perfect case in point. And yet now we're inundated with messages from every well-intentioned company and organization singing from the same book of hymns. I mean, Black Lives Matter is everywhere. Of course Black Lives Matter, but the messaging of this movement around the reality of police violence is wrong, and it's creating a public hysteria.
It's not, and it's not. I don't know how you think things that don't directly benefit the wealthy get done in American politics, but this is how. Activism and engagement, sustained pressure, driving attention towards causes and policies, attracting money and people's time, putting pressure on politicians to legislate. That's how you create real-world change.
We have to pull back from the brink here.
All right, remember when I clairvoyantly predicted that you'd never provide ways we could actually do this? Well, here we are.
And all we have with which to do that is conversation.
Yeah, I agree, Sam, and I hope that today's debate was in some way helpful.
I mean, the only thing that makes conversation possible is an openness to evidence and arguments, a willingness to update one's view of the world when better reasons are given.
I'm glad you say that, Sam.
And that is an ongoing process, not a place we ever finally arrive.
I agree with you fully on this.
And you know what? This is a good place to wrap things up. Thank you again, Sam. I want to extend a huge thank you from our team for not agreeing to be on the show today. We really wonder if you'll ever even know it happened. Anyway, we so appreciate the time you didn't give us. Thanks again. It's really been a true pleasure. Thank you. Well, that concludes this episode of One-Sided Debates. As always, let us know in the comments which positions were better argued, what kinds of debate tactics you thought were more effective, if you were persuaded by either debater or not, or, anything else you want to get out there. We'll read them all, we promise. One-Sided Debates is independently run by a collective of people who wish to remain anonymous. We've got lives to live, people! There's no time for trolls. If you want to support the work we do, the best way to do that is to donate to our Patreon. Patreon keeps us independent, free from corporate influence.
Our music is by Hips.
If there's media that you'd like to see debated, feel free to send it our way at onesideddebates@gmail.com. Or if you just feel like saying hi, that's the same email address. We've only got one.